Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we test the robustness of some of the conventional wisdom in this field. Today's episode is a discussion with UC Berkeley professor and cell biologist Randy Schekman. Randy is probably most famous for winning the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine, along with Thomas Sudhoff and James Rothman, for their discoveries of machinery regulating vesicle traffic, which is a major transport system in our cells. But he's also been editor-in-chief of three of the world's most prestigious scientific journals: Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, or PNAS, Annual Review of Cell and Developmental Biology, and eLife. Randy's been outspoken about certain aspects of the scientific peer review process, especially the way that luxury journals and impact factors distort the science, as he puts it. Let me just be clear that this critique does not imply a mistrust of science. I believe, and I expect that Randy also believes, that science is the best method we have for accumulating knowledge to drive the flourishing of humankind. So our discussion is a critique of some quite specific but important details of a process that is overall serving us really well. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's hear what Randy has to say. In the intro to the discussion, I will have already explained that you're a cell biologist and not a conservation biologist, which is usual for this podcast. But could you tell us how an interest in microscopic biodiversity at a young age got you interested in science and basically set the direction for your career?
Yeah. As a kid, I somehow developed an interest in microorganisms, which came from a toy microscope that I had and a jar of pond scum that I acquired from a neighborhood creek. And I was just amazed at the diversity of life that you could see with the aid of a simple microscope. And that one image captivated me. And for the rest of my time in school, before I went to university, every year I did a science fair project using a simple light microscope and visualizing mostly microorganisms. But in my last project, I was looking at red blood cells from hamsters. And the microscope got put away. When I went to university, I decided to major in bacteriology because of that interest. That morphed very quickly into molecular biology because I had the opportunity in my first year at university to work in a lab. The lab happened to be working on bacterial viruses using genetics. And the professor, who was himself just a young assistant professor, gave me a book to read because he realized I knew nothing about the subject. It was the book was called The Molecular Biology of the Gene. It was the first edition of the very famous textbook that James Watson wrote, and that book really changed my life. You know, it was an inspiration, even though subsequently Watson's reputation and the way that he treats people is not what I would emulate. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, he's a very gifted writer. And so that, and the next year when he first published this notorious book called The Double Helix about his experiences in Cambridge, I didn't see it as anything, unprofessional. To me, it was just scintillating that you could conceive with simple observations the profound structure of life in the form of a DNA molecule. So that got me hooked. I was intending to go to medical school, but that quickly evaporated when I realized that science was in my future. So although it may have been started with an interest in observational diversity, what it very quickly focused on molecules, particularly on DNA molecules and how they were replicated. That was my graduate training. And then I wanted to branch off into something distinct. And so for my postdoctoral work and subsequently my career here at Berkeley, I decided to focus on how membranes are assembled. Because I thought that the tools that were available at the time to understand how macromolecules were duplicated could also be applied to how biological membranes could template their own reproduction. And that then became the subject of my now 45-year career here at Berkeley.
And that microscope that you mentioned, I heard that has found a place.
Yes.
Maybe you can tell us the story of where that is now.
Sure. Well, early on, when I had a toy microscope, I realized that there were better instruments to be had, and so I resolved to save money from earnings, from odd jobs that I did, to buy a student professional microscope, a Bosch & Lomb microscope, and I kept my money in an envelope in my bedroom, but my mother kept borrowing the money, and I could never quite get to the $100 that I needed to buy this Bosch & Lomb microscope. So one morning after mowing a neighbor's lawn, I rode my bicycle to the local police station, and I told the duty officer that I was running away from home because my mother was stealing my money. So that afternoon, after a conversation that my father had with the captain of the police department, we rode to a pawn shop in a city nearby, and I bought that microscope, which became the pride and joy of the rest of my years at home. Indeed, my father recently died, and there was a treasure trove of pictures, including a picture of me peering into that microscope in a high school science fair project that I was doing. No, that picture was available. Anyway, of course, when I went away to university and subsequently, that old microscope just sat around and collected dust. Fortunately, my parents saved it and sent it up to me, to my home near Berkeley. And in the days after the Nobel Prize was announced, every year the Nobel Museum inquires of all new laureates if they have some artifact of their research that they would wish to donate. And so I thought of that microscope. And so I sent it in, and now apparently it's a popular exhibit. You can see that microscope on display in the Nobel Museum. So hard to believe when I had that thing where it would end up. I mean, that's just...
Yeah, lovely story that.
So there you have it.
Mm-hmm. The topic of the discussion is something that relates as much to cell biology as it does to biodiversity science. And that topic is the publication of scientific knowledge, and perhaps we'll also get around to talking about access to that knowledge. So let me start by asking, how would you describe to a non-scientist the process of publishing scientific research, and why is that such an important part of the overall scientific process?
Well, it's central to the scientific enterprise that we produce an accurate document of our observations and disseminate it to our peers around the world so that they can not only read and appreciate new observations, but importantly, so that they can attempt to reproduce it in their own laboratory. The replication of scientific observations is absolutely critical for establishing and validating a conclusion. I mean, evolution itself is the product of decades and decades of replication and observation at ever increasing levels of sophistication. And it's why we as biologists are so confident in evolution. So everything that we do has to be published. That is the intention of one's research career, to publish one's work, because otherwise there's no foundation upon which science can build. And so over this the centuries since the Royal Society first had proceedings that they published as a result of oral presentations at their meetings, the literature has built up and changed quite dramatically over the years. When I was a graduate student, I had a certain journal that I preferred to publish in. It happened to be a journal that was published by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the PNAS. Even though at the time, articles published in the PNAS were either contributed by or communicated by a member of the National Academy. You, as a normal scientist, weren't allowed to send a paper in. It had to be communicated by a member of the Academy.
When did that change, by the way?
That changed. My predecessor as the editor of the PNAS, Nicholas Cosarelli, changed that probably in the early 2000s.
Oh, as recently as that? Wow. Okay.
Yes. And then when I became the editor, we did away with the member communicated track because that was widely abused. So there's a vast majority of submissions now to the PNAS are direct submissions. And this is true of any scientific journal. You as a investigator write up your work and you submit it to a journal. It's then handled by a member of the editorial staff or a member of the editorial board, and that is a peer, someone in your broad area of research, who then will often consult other members of the editorial board to determine if the work is appropriate for the journal, that is, if it's in the research area of relevance for the journal, or if there's some subjective assessment of its importance. And then it's subjected to a more detailed peer review usually by anonymous experts in the granular area of this research. And they then write their opinions independently, sometimes conferring with members of their laboratory. And the reviews are then submitted back to the journal, and depending on the nature of the journal, it is considered by a member of the editorial board. And that person is then charged with making the decision about whether the paper merits publication or revision or rejection. Most often, depending on the journal, it's either revision or rejection. A paper is very rarely published without revision. And that has worked very well over many, many decades. But that process has changed. And I think a fundamental change came with the move of commercial publishers increasingly into a dominant role. The largest commercial publishers are Elsevier and Springer Nature now, Springer Nature, and then some other large scientific societies, Journal of the American Medical Association for Clinical Work, the American Chemical Society, and other scientific societies. But in my opinion, the atmosphere has changed dramatically with the, let me call it, intrusion of professional commercial publishers into this process. And that's a subject that I think probably you'll want to draw me out on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that most people, myself included, with an extent of knowledge of the scientific publishing process, and also non-scientists, are completely unaware of the fact that there is this kind of division between different kinds of journals. We just sort of see the titles of the journals. And I wanted to ask specifically about some of those journals, but just also to put a bit of a timestamp on things. When did that happen, that sort of transition to the dominance of this more commercial?
The journal Nature has been around for over 150 years. Science magazine, which is published by a large scientific society, has also been around for 100 years. PNAS has been around for 100 years. But there's a fundamental difference between journals that are run by scientific societies, for the most part, and the commercial journals or science. Science, a semi-commercial journal. It makes a large profit for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Commercial journals were important, but somehow they weren't so dominant. I mean, Nature was always an important journal, and Nature is a valuable resource for the scientific community, largely because they have journalists who write on subjects of interest to us that you won't find in newspapers. That's the front material in Nature and in Science. Those are really valuable, really irreplaceable, I would say. But they also publish original research articles. And the way that they've handled these research articles has evolved. Nature, for instance, back when I was a graduate student, the reviews were done entirely internal. They rarely consulted outside scientists for opinions. They would decide what was topical, and they would have a cadre of professional editors who would make these determinations. And, some very important papers were published in Nature and Science, but it wasn't as dominant. They weren't as dominant as they are now. So several things happened. One thing that I think happened in biology, or at least in cell biology, was a former Nature editor by the name of Benjamin Lewin, started this journal, Cell, back in the mid to late 1970s. And Lewin was a marketing genius. And he recognized something that I don't think had been appreciated before that, and that is scientists are vain. And they like to be, they would never admit this, but they'd like to be part of an exclusive country club. And so he set up a system where he, with his quite expert judgment in certain matters, he was the arbiter of taste. And he would decide whether something was really hot. And he would then have it reviewed. He could sometimes, this was long before email or even fax, he would put a manuscript in the back of a taxi cab and send it across Boston to have someone else review it, in a timely manner.
Mm-hmm.
And he would, take these decisions, recommendations himself and judge whether something was worth publishing. And so it became a kind of a club. At first, it was a club almost exclusive to MIT, because that's where the press was located. And it caught on very quickly. I remember a transition of about a year when I still wanted my best work to be in the PNAS, which was reviewed and judged by active scholars, to wanting my work published in a journal that was judged by Benjamin Lewin, because it was kind of an imprimatur. He very clever. It was a marketing success for him. Eventually, he sold Cell to Elsevier and reportedly made $100 million on the sale. So he's a genius, and Elsevier has exploited that. They've cloned the journal into many little mini journals, each exclusive to its own community. Nature has done likewise. And now we find that many investigators will only publish in these journals. They eschew the use of of journals in their professional society, except for work that they consider a sort of secondary.
Or at least they'll aim for that, right?
They'll aim for the high end and then, move down the food chain.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, this trend was encouraged in a way by a simultaneous creation of a metric, which actually came in the 1970s by an outfit in the US, originally the Institute for Scientific Information. And their founder, Eugene Garfield, invented something called the impact factor, which was it's a crude measurement of the popularity of a journal. It's the number of citations to a journal over a 2-year period divided by the number of articles. And this number, according to Garfield, was created for the benefit of librarians to decide which journals to subscribe to. But over the years, it morphed into a metric of individual merit, for which it is not an accurate measurement at all. Indeed, some of the most original work is rarely cited during the first years after it's published.
Mm-hmm.
But this metric, and particularly one number out of many that he created, one number measures a narrow window of 2 years of popularity. And so it has changed journal editors, and particularly these professional editors who are, after all, employed by Elsevier or employed by Springer Nature, basically to sell magazines. Mm-hmm. They will deny this, but it influences the kinds of things that they will promote for review and for publication, because they think they're going to generate buzz in the form of citation. Indeed, these editors now scour the archives, the bioarchive or the physics archive, and they look for things that generate comment, or they look for things that generate tweets. And then they invite these papers to be submitted for review because they think they're likely to generate interest. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a complete distortion of scholarship. And so, I've railed against this since before I had this little soapbox in 2013. When I was the editor of the PNAS, my predecessor had routinely during editorial board meetings asked how the impact factor was doing. And I thought, we're the members of the National Academy of Sciences. We will judge what's good science. Mm-hmm. We're not going to go by some popularity measurement. But then I found when I became the editor-in-chief that one of the staff members said that I really should be encouraging the members of the editorial board to reject more papers because it would lend this air of exclusivity to the journal and thus increase our impact factor. Mm. And I said, we will not do that. I make these decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So then when the Nobel was announced and I had moved on to become the founding editor of this journal, eLife, my team at the journal and I decided to craft an editorial in The Guardian that would be announced on the day of the Nobel ceremony, which was accompanied by my debating a science editor live on BBC4.
I've tried to find that interview unsuccessfully. Is it not recorded anymore?
I don't know if it's available. That's a shame. I'd love to listen back at it again.
Mm-hmm. So quite a few questions sort of related to that. One of them is, I think you've expressed some of the aspects of these, what you call luxury journals, somewhat pejoratively, like Nature and Science and Cell. And you mentioned professional editors as being a part of the problem. Could you kind of mention what is the issue specifically with professional editors, and have you mentioned everything else that's sort of wrong with those journals, or is there anything else to add there?
Well, I hate to say this because it seems arrogant, but these are fine people. They were trained as scientists. Many of them were, fine PhD level research. Most of them have been postdoctorals. And they may have a very active interest in journalism, scientific journalism, and they may enjoy the aspect of the job which calls on them to review areas of research that are very broad. And so I don't like to criticize them as a group. I've met some very fine professional editors. But the problem is that they are employed by the publisher, by the journal, to identify things that are going to be attractive for the journal. And I think that they compromise on the depth of scholarship sometimes for the buzz. Mm. They look to popular areas. In fact, in a way, they're guiding certain popular areas in their selections. And then, of course, they're called on to review papers in areas well beyond their own expertise. And so they will very typically, of course, call on individual scientists to render opinions. And then they have to judge sometimes a half a dozen different opinions, which don't necessarily align. Mm-hmm. And they are incapable of doing so. So very often what they'll do is they'll just take the weak link. They'll say, here's a review that's highly critical. You're going to have to do this. And until fairly recently, they have not given the primary reviewers the opportunity to review each other's comments. Mm. And frankly, that's what we did at eLife. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's part of our process where the reviewers are obliged to confer with each other and to be identified to each other by name so that when you're going to review a paper for eLife that you're going to have to defend your remarks. You can't hide behind your anonymity. Mm-hmm. That, I think, has sharpened the process. And now many of these journals do allow the reviews to be shared, but they typically do not allow identities to be shared. Mm-hmm. And they still hold the authority to themselves as editors, mm-hmm. as professional editors, mm-hmm. because I think they're, frankly, in conflict. They deny this. They deny that impact factor is being used as a measure, but I don't believe it.
Mm-hmm. You've also mentioned that apart from the 2-year time frame being a problem, also some of these journals, I think Nature and Science in particular, I'm not so sure about Cell, but they limit the number of articles artificially, so that the issues are fairly compact, aren't they?
Yeah, it's so artificial because Nature and Science have a page limit to what they can print each week, and because their circulation is so high, it actually adds a great deal of expense. This is completely artificial in the modern electronic world. Why they don't allow full-length papers, more full-length papers, is ridiculous. And but it's part of their business plan. The part of the business plan is branding, and then this exclusivity. Nature publishes 8% of the papers that are submitted. Science 6%. And this is quite deliberate. Mm-hmm. It needn't be. That level of selectivity ends up sometimes being capricious. And of course, the pathology of it is that these papers almost invariably go back to the author and to his or her poor postdocs or students who are then bombarded with these criticisms. And I submit to you that in some instances, it reveals character flaws in these people. You may have seen, I've certainly commented on this, but it's been independently in press. Some years ago, a major biotech company in California called Amgen published a paper, actually in Nature, where they alarmingly reported that most of the key observations in important cancer biology papers on which they would rely for the development of chemotherapeutic agents, many of the key observations, like 85% of them, could not be replicated in the controlled conditions of their laboratories. And these companies, live and die on the replicability of their results. And it was actually the key scientist, was an Australian scientist. I met him actually when I visited Australia a few years ago. And he reported, unfortunately, the company, it was not in the best financial interest of the company to reveal all of the work that they'd done. It was kind of their own conflict of interest. But this fellow revealed publicly that he confronted at a meeting, a cancer biology meeting, he confronted the senior author of one of the papers that they could not replicate. And he said, look, we tried your experiment 50 times and it never worked. And the author said, and I quote, well, we did it 6 times. It worked once, and that fit the paper better, so that's what we published.
Wow.
An unbelievable admission. Obviously, this person had a character flaw, but I don't think that's unusual. I think there's a lot of cherry picking that goes on, and it is, to a large extent in my mind, the pressure that comes from these hyper-selective journals. And the certain knowledge that young scholars have that if they don't manage to get their precious work published in one of these hyper-selective journals, they will not have a career. And it continues to this day in spite of anything that I've said. I won't publish in these journals, and some of my colleagues won't, but most of them succumb to this enormous pressure. It's a distortion, and I think it influences the replicability of some very important work.
And that has societal implications. It's not
absolutely. If Congress, when this hit the press some years ago, people in Congress said, why are we spending $30 billion a year on the NIH budget when most of the work is not accurate?
That's very interesting. I had never really considered luxury journals to be playing a particular role in the replicability crisis. You've also touched on the issue of not publishing negative results, which was kind of a bonus question I had right at the end, but seeing as it's close to what we're talking about now, what are your thoughts on that? And not necessarily in relation to these big journals, but just more generally, do you think that that's a big issue in science that is compromising the scientific peer review?
Let me talk about 2 kinds of negative results. One kind is where you attempt to repeat something that's been published in one of these luxury journals and you can't. Then you find that these journals will simply ignore you. You can write to any number of editors of these journals, and generally they're not interested because they don't like to admit their mistakes. They don't own their own mistakes. I mean, occasionally they're forced to retract a paper. I'll give you an example that I think is just an extreme. You may recall, maybe now over 10 years ago, there was an amazing paper published in Science that claimed that a bacterium growing in a lake east of the Sierras, Mono Lake, growing in a salty brine, had changed its metabolism entirely to allow arsenate to replace phosphate in the growth of this bug. And it got published in Science. And immediately, people who know bacteria realized that this was an artifact because you have to take special pains to rid growth medium, water, of any phosphate because it can be scavenged in, sub-nanomolar concentrations. And although science will never admit this, it's likely that the paper was reviewed by two geologists and by a professional editor on staff who knew nothing. And then Science did publish reports that contradicted this, but they never retracted that original paper because the authors threatened legal action. That paper would never have been published in a journal that was run by real scientists. And I think there are lots of examples of that. So, okay, so that's one kind of negative, negative result where you can't and so when I was first editor of eLife, we started getting requests from authors of such negative results trying to counter papers that were published in these luxury journals. And why, I didn't like that. We published a few of them, but I didn't like cleaning up the dirty mess left by these luxury journals. Okay, so that's one kind of thing. And I think there are all kinds of problems with this. If a journal finds, and this afflicts all journals, if a journal finds that something is there's evidence of fraudulent manipulation of data, the journals typically don't have the investigative wherewithal to conduct a full review of the record. And so what they do is they turn it over to the home institution of the investigator who's been challenged in this way. And that represents a huge conflict of interest. Because often these are prominent individuals at the home institution, and the institution is therefore loath to find fault. I've seen many examples of this. Okay. Now, more often, the negative results that people think of are not necessarily challenging something that's been published, but just they have a hypothesis, they tested it, and they proved that the hypothesis is wrong, or they have strong evidence. And what do you do with this? Of course, is the problem. Very few journals that are selective would be interested in publishing this. Frankly, eLife wouldn't be either. Certainly not PNAS. So what do you do with it? Well, now we have a solution to that problem. It's called the archive. The physics archive, the bioarchive, the med archive. This is a place where you've done a piece of work, you're satisfied with it, it's met your own expectations, and you can post it online for all to see. I think this has been a godsend, because now, instead of just having 3 or 4 primary reviewers on a paper, you can have thousands of eyes on a paper. During the pandemic, we've seen the advantage of people having posted things on the archive because you can find flaws. Probably the most notorious medical research paper in the past few decades was published by this Elsevier journal, Lancet. The Lancet published a paper now 20 years ago by a British physician by the name of Andrew Wakefield, who claimed, not overtly, but claimed in the paper that vaccinations may be a source of autism.
So that's where that whole thing started. Okay.
Oh yeah, this was an example. I met on an occasion somebody who was on one of the professional editors at Lancet when this paper came through. It was reviewed very critically by clinicians who thought it should be rejected because, statistically weak. And even the in-house staff didn't want to publish this paper because of its implications. But the editor or the publisher, the guy in charge, said, wow, this is some story. We can't suppress it. So it was published. It was just for buzz. And look at the damage that has done, even now, to our vaccination effort. Wakefield the paper was eventually, after 12 years, was retracted.
Well, after the damage was done.
Damage was and continues to be. Wakefield himself was drummed out of his clinical position at the university, but he's had a little second life now, fomenting anti-vaccination efforts around the world. So the journals have a great deal of responsibility that they have to live up to, and succumbing to the pressures of popularity and subscription revenue is a formula for disaster.
I was wondering, looking at that 2013 Guardian piece that you timed to coincide with being awarded the Nobel Prize, I was wondering what's happened since then. So that's 8 years ago now. Do you think that progress has been made in the direction you were hoping it would be made? Maybe I haven't looked enough, but I haven't really seen prominent people talk as loudly about this as you have since then.
Yeah. The answer to that is mixed. I would say, in one respect, no, there's been very little progress. In another respect, there has been. And that is, the one silver lining to all this, which wasn't really explicitly discussed in that Guardian piece, but it was certainly in the background, was the importance of open access. And I think that, we're winning the battle there because funding agencies, particularly private funding agencies, realize that the work that they're supporting should be available publicly. And it's an outrage that even a federal funding agency pays for work, and then it's not accessible to taxpayers. Mm-hmm. If those taxpayers happen to be interested, or to physicians who are not in some big clinical practice, mm-hmm. or to biotech companies who can't afford the license fees for these journals, or to high schools. When I was a high school student, we used to have a subscription to Science magazine in my high school library, and I used to, read it when I could. I found that very often high schools no longer have these magazines because of the cost.
I know that the per article cost it's at least $36 for the average. It's not a few dollars. It's a pretty substantial amount. But what about the subscriptions that you're talking about? For example, a yearly subscription to Science or Nature?
Well, they aren't probably that much. I think, but they're enough that, if you have a little biotech business and you want to have all the relevant journals, it becomes a major expense. Mm-hmm. So these startup companies, very often they just, find friends to send them the PDF of the article, or mm-hmm. as is true now of many people, they use this basically pirating service in Eastern Europe, run by one brave woman who has resisted Interpol, mm-hmm. arrest by Interpol.
For many years now.
Pirate the entire biomedical or scientific literature. It's like, mm-hmm. it's a credit to her, but it's a symptom. It's a shame that it has to be something illegal, but it's a symptom of this avaricious control mm-hmm. by these publishers. Elsevier has the largest profit margin of it, like any corporation in the world. They charge you coming and going, and then they rely on scientists to review the papers for them. Mm-hmm. It's a great business if you can mm-hmm. get it.
A whole huge army of volunteers helping.
Yeah, volunteers who think that they're going to get some privileged information and they're going to curry favor with the editor that they will eventually rely on to get their work published. Mm-hmm. It's a racket.
Before you made the decision in 2013 not to publish with these journals, you had about 30-something articles, I think, I said mostly in Cell, but also in Science and Nature. And I guess a lot of people might say, they would join you and they're behind you, but, they can't do that now because they haven't won a Nobel Prize yet. So what would you say to that argument?
Well, of course, mea culpa. I succumbed to the marketing allure of these journals. But I will say that well before I won the Nobel, I had grown to dislike these journals because of their use of this stupid impact factor. I used to show a slide of an advertisement that Nature put out, which was Nature, and then in big kind of false glowing image, a huge number, 42.395. That was their impact factor. Mm. What BS. Mm-hmm. So it was only when I had that little soapbox that I could say what I said and have some resonance. But I just want to make sure that when we evaluate young scholars for positions, mm-hmm. that we evaluate the work, the merit of the work, rather than the journal that it's published in, and certainly mm-hmm. not the impact factor of the journal that it's published in. I mean, I see CVs sent for reviews that I conduct for young scholars, where they put their top papers and they list the impact factor of the journal. I saw one case where a guy had the papers aligned not chronologically, but in descending order of the impact factor of the journal in which it was published.
I guess that kind of what I was originally asking was, what do you expect of people like me? But I guess that the best that I can do is to be aware of that. And if I'm in a position to evaluate work, to simply not use that as a factor.
Yes, absolutely. You should not. I mean, people sit around at job committees, and they don't read the papers. They just see that somebody's published 3 Nature papers and they must be special. Well, not really.
Something related to that is that I noticed this, at least in my field, so often these Nature and Science papers have 20 or 30 authors as well. So you can say you published in Nature, meanwhile your contribution, even if it's a brilliant piece of science, your contribution might have been absolutely minimal.
Well, some areas of science simply require a huge team effort. And I don't think we should discourage that. I think collaborations are increasingly important. I'm now involved in a major initiative to support Parkinson's disease research around the world. We're aligned with the Michael J. Fox Foundation in the U.S., but we have a very wealthy private benefactor who has a personal interest in this. And so we have set up a consortium now of 100 different laboratories, with more coming, organized into teams of 4 or 5 PIs who are now obliged to communicate with each other online all the time about what they're doing, and trying to get them to collaborate. And many of them, we selected them because of a history of collaborative skill. And many of them have embraced this, and it's wonderful. And they'll end up publishing papers with lots of names on them. The problem is the reward structure in academic science favors the individual. And so young scholars who collaborate are in some peril if they collaborate too much, because then when it comes time for tenure, the review committee wonders, what part of this was our guys, and that's a shame. It really is a shame. I've seen that in action here in my own department. So I don't think it's necessarily bad that some papers have a lot of authors, but you're right. How do you judge what someone's done? It's certainly not just because and there's also something about these very high-profile journals. They really like these papers with lots of names on them, because that guarantees that they're going to get a lot of citations, because every author on that list of 500 will cite that paper. I don't have a solution.
Right.
I do for myself. I tell my people that I'm happy to consider almost any journal, as long as all the relevant decisions are made by active scholars.
As opposed to professional editors.
Yeah, that's my bottom line. And, I hate to, again, it sounds arrogant, and I'm sure these people despise me when I say things like this, but a lot of them are not really qualified to judge much. And they are in a position of their job is to sell magazines.
You mentioned that judging work by its inherent merits is kind of the alternative to an impact factor. But is there a measure, if you have to use a measure, if you don't have time to evaluate every piece of a scholar's work, is there a better option to impact factor?
Okay, well, I believe that a well-crafted, brief narrative is going to be superior to any number that's cooked up. And so what I've been recommending when people ask me, people, of course, ask all the time, you reject this, but I'm a young guy and I need to make a career. How can I sell myself? So what I think people should do, and this would be true of scholars at any stage in their career, have a very carefully written paragraph that describes what you've discovered. Not just from one paper, but the corpus of your work, crafted into a narrative. And that would be a paragraph that would be part of your letter of introduction for a job or a fellowship. There is one situation that I am very aware of where that works, and that is when people are considered as candidates for election to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. Someone, the nominator, or sometimes it's the candidate themselves, you have to assemble a document that includes a brief CV, a list of 12 of your most important papers, and then 2 narratives, one 50-word and the other 250 words. The 50-word is sort of the bullet. Here's what I've discovered. The 250-word kind of fleshes that out. And when members of the Academy, which covers all science, they have to vote on the members who are selected, whether they're in their area or not. They can't judge papers. It doesn't matter what journals they're published in. They can't judge the papers except in their own narrow area. But if you read a well-written narrative that's written for a broadly scientifically knowledgeable audience, or in the case of a job or a fellowship, crafted for that discipline, that should be a good first way of evaluating whether someone has done something that sounds really interesting. Now, you may ask, if someone's done this and they misrepresented their work, how can you how do you know? So one idea I had was that everyone who had to write such a paragraph would have to have it countersigned by 2 senior people who are not necessarily mentors of that person. I sign that everything in this statement is true. And that would be, the first document that you would present. And that could, you sitting on a committee, you could look at hundreds of these and judge, what sounds interesting, relevant to what we're interested in hiring here. And then you'd make a short list, and then you'd look at the letters of recommendation from noted authorities in the field, and then you might have a chance to actually read some of the papers.
And speak to the individual, I guess, to get more of the detail.
Of course. Then, now with the advent of Zoom, when it's working, you can interview people by Zoom first before you have a more in-depth interview.
So very much more of a focus on qualitative rather than quantitative measures.
Absolutely. Yeah.
A big thanks to Randy for his time and his thoughts and his willingness to share them with us. Next time I'll be talking with Colorado State University professor and disease ecologist Dan Salkeld. We'll be addressing a topic similar to the topic of episode 2 of the podcast with David Duthie back in September 2020. David and I discussed the links between nature and the risk of spillover of zoonotic diseases. Dan and I will be talking about whether biodiversity in particular reduces spillover risk. This is something that Dan has studied and written about for many years and about which he speaks with humility and nuance. I think you'll find it really interesting, so I hope you can join us.